What would you do if all you had were $2 and two small hands looking up at you? Hungry? Caroline never wanted pity, just a piece of bread for her daughters. But on the coldest morning of her life, someone was watching. Someone who saw more than need. He saw dignity in the struggle. This isn't a story about charity. It's about how one quiet act of kindness changed the course of 4 lives forever. And how a woman the world overlooked became the heart of something bigger than success, a new definition of family, purpose, and what it truly means to be rich. Prepare to feel every word, to believe in second chances, and to remember that sometimes the smallest moments rewrite everything. It was the kind of winter morning that pressed against your spirit. The air felt sharp, almost metallic, and frost clung to the bakery windows like delicate frozen veins. Inside maple crust, the smell of cinnamon, melted butter, and fresh bread wrapped itself around every corner, trying to shield customers from the biting cold outside. Caroline Miller stepped in with her twin daughters, Lucy and Abby, each holding one of her hands. The girls wore mismatched mittens and identical coats, second-hand, mended so many times they barely resembled their original fabric. Their cheeks were pink from the cold, their seams fraying, but they radiated joy. Children often do, even when life doesn't give them much reason to. Caroline smiled softly but guardedly. Her steps were slow, cautious, as she approached the counter. She looked at the rows of golden croissants, braided challah, chocolate chip muffins, and rustic sourdough with the kind of reverence most reserved for art. But to her, this display was just as unreachable. She had exactly $2.35 in her pocket. She'd counted it before they left their small apartment that morning, while Lucy brushed Abby's hair and the girls sang to each other. The money was for something warm, not for herself, of course, but for them. A treat, a bit of normalcy, a joy. "Good morning," said the woman behind the counter, smiling as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Good morning," Caroline replied, her voice steady despite the storm within her. "We were wondering if you had any of yesterday's bread left." The woman nodded. "We do. A few rolls and half a loaf of rye." "Could I see the rolls?" Caroline asked gratefully. Lucy pointed eagerly. "Mummy, what about that one? The swirly one with raisins?" Caroline's chest tightened. She remembered that roll, not from eating it, but because one of the girls had once described it after a classmate shared a snack. Raisins and cinnamon, sweetness they hadn't tasted in months. She picked up the roll and placed it on the scale, then hesitated, adding a second smaller roll. Her eyes went to the digital price, $4.75. Her fingers tensed. She reached into her pocket and took out the coins. She already knew, but counted anyway, slowly, hoping the math had somehow changed. It hadn't. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Could we just take the one?" Silence. The kind that swallows the air. The clerk nodded kindly and returned the second roll to the tray. Lucy and Abby didn't complain. They watched their mother with quiet trust. Hands on the counter, Caroline handed over the coins and received the single raisin roll, wrapped in thin paper. Across the room, Alexander Harris watched, seated near the back, nursing a lukewarm coffee while waiting for a call that never came. He looked out from behind tailored clothes and luxury credentials. Alexander had built an empire in luxury, hotels, private retreats, exclusive services. His world was curated, but at that moment, none of it mattered, because he couldn't stop watching the woman at the counter, how she split a small roll in two and gave each half to her daughters. The girls lit up like it was a treasure. Caroline smiled, but it was a smile that held back tears. A mother's smile, the kind that holds everything together by sheer will. He didn't know why he couldn't look away. Maybe it was her dignity. Maybe it was the coat worn thin, but her posture still proud. Or maybe it was the girls, how they looked at her like she'd never failed them. As they turned to leave, one of the twins dropped a mitten. Caroline bent down to pick it up, and Alexander saw the edge of a sweatshirt beneath her coat. The kind you wear indoors when you can't afford to heat every room. Something stirred inside him. It wasn't pity. He hated pity. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. the quiet understanding that the strongest stories often go untold. He walked to the counter once they left. "The woman who was just here. Caroline?" The clerk looked at him. "Yes. Do you know her?" "No," he replied. "Not yet." He paused. "Could I leave something for her?" "Anonymously?" The clerk blinked, then nodded. Alexander handed her a bill. "Could you pack a few things? Bread, preserves, maybe cheese. Enough for a few days. Some cookies. And those gingerbread bears." He pointed to the window display. "Oh, and say it was included in her earlier purchase. Make it feel natural." The woman nodded, surprised but touched. Outside, Caroline and the girls waited at the bus stop. The wind had picked up. They huddled together under a shared blanket. Caroline brushed their hair from their eyes and kissed their heads. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Just then, the bakery door flew open. "Wait!" the clerk called, rushing toward her. "This was left behind." Caroline blinked. "I think there's a mistake." "No, it's yours," the clerk insisted, handing her a warm bag. "Already paid for. Enjoy." She walked off before Caroline could ask anything. Inside the bag was more than she could have imagined. Bread, cheese, jam, honey, milk, and the gingerbread bears. Abby clapped. "Mommy, look!" "The bears are happy." Caroline stared. Her hands trembled. It was too much, too kind, too unexpected. She looked back at the window. Alexander was gone. She didn't see him, didn't know his name, but a warmth filled her chest that had nothing to do with food. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen. They sat on the bench sharing bread, licking honey from their fingers, laughing. Alexander sat in his car, the image of them etched in his mind. He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the end of a generous moment. It was the beginning of something he wouldn't be able to walk away from, something he'd one day call home. The snow was falling heavier now, soft, quiet, but relentless. It blanketed the town in silence, softening the city's harsh edges. Caroline walked home slowly, holding her daughter's hands, the warm bag from the bakery, pressed tightly to her chest, like it was something sacred. Her breath floated in clouds, and every few steps, she looked down at the girls to see if they were too cold, too tired to anything. Lucy skipped, splashing into a slushy puddle, while Abby hummed a tune under her breath. They didn't know the food had been a gift. Caroline hadn't told them. She wasn't sure how. Part of her didn't even want to believe it herself. Good things like that didn't happen, not to her, not in real life. But as they climbed the stairs to their tiny apartment, 2 flights, no elevator, barely working heat, she saw something that made her stop for a second. The flicker of hope in her daughter's eyes. They were excited. For bread, for honey, to eat like it was Christmas morning. Something inside her cracked, quietly, deeply. She closed the door behind them, hung their wet coats on rusty hooks, and turned on the little space heater in the kitchen. Then she unpacked the bag with a reverence that felt almost ceremonial. The girls squealed when she handed them the gingerbread bears, and for a few precious minutes, the apartment filled with a sound that hadn't been heard. There in a long time, laughter, joy. Caroline stood at the counter, slicing bread for dinner, but her mind was somewhere else, tangled in questions. Who had done this? Why? Was it pity? Was someone watching? Was this safe? She didn't like the feeling of being in someone's debt, but she couldn't ignore the timing. The pantry was empty, rent was overdue. Her boss had just cut her shifts. She had applied for 2 more cleaning jobs last week and hadn't heard anything back. She was running out of options. And then this. Across town, Alexander sat in the back of his car, staring through the snow-covered windshield, unmoving. His driver waited in silence, used to his client's long pauses. Alexander held a tablet in his lap, untouched for the past 10 minutes. That month alone, he had made dozens of major business decisions, some smart, others cold. None of them stayed with him like that mother and her daughters on a bench, eating shared bread, laughing like it was the best thing in the world. It shouldn't have mattered. He shouldn't have cared, but he did. For the first time in months, maybe years, something had broken. Through the noise of his life, acquisitions, meetings, numbers, deals. And it wasn't anything big or dramatic. It was quiet, ordinary, real. He picked up his phone. "Julia," he said when his assistant answered, "I need you to find someone." Her name is Caroline Miller. Lives near Maple Crust Bakery. 2 daughters. Shouldn't be hard. I want to know where she works, what she does, and if she's looking for anything. Julia didn't ask why. She never did. I'll get right on it. Alexander ended the call, leaned back in the leather seat and sighed. He hadn't planned this. He didn't even know what this was. All he knew was that something about that woman made him want to help, not with a check, not with distance, but in a way that actually mattered, in a way that changed things. Back in her apartment, Caroline did the dishes and tucked the girls into bed. She brushed their curls aside, whispered soft words into their dreams. The electricity flickered twice, so she added an extra blanket over them just in case. She didn't sleep much that night. She sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of tea she reheated 3 times, staring through the window as snow continued to fall, like time itself, slow, steady, indifferent. The next morning she woke up early and dressed quietly. She had a shift at the diner, then 3 hours of office cleaning up town. It would be another long, exhausting day. She didn't know that someone was already asking about her. By noon, Alexander held a manila folder in his hands. Caroline Miller, age 32, single mother. No contact with the father, waitress, office cleaner, former part-time tutor at a community center. No criminal record, no history of substance abuse. Lives in a rent-controlled apartment in a worn-down building on the edge of town. Dependable, hard-working, honest. He stared at the folder, longer than necessary. "Where is she today?" he asked. Julia answered. "She's working the breakfast shift at the diner until 2. He stood. "I'm going." Julia blinked. "Sir?" "I just want to see." The diner was small, a little old-fashioned, with faded booths and a scratched counter. Caroline moved through the space with a quiet rhythm. Her apron was plain, her hair tied back. Her shoes, he noticed, had holes in the soles, but she smiled when customers thanked her, apologized when food took too long, joked with the cook even when he grumbled, cleaned up spills without flinching. She made eye contact with the elderly man who stayed for hours over a bowl of soup. She refilled glasses like it mattered. Alexander sat in the back. He didn't speak, didn't approach. He just watched, and he was moved. She looked tired but steady, worn down but full of grace. It wasn't just that she needed help. It was that she deserved it. When she stepped outside for her break and checked a voicemail, the cold hit her like a slap. She leaned against the wall, listening. It was another job rejection. Her shoulders sagged. Her breath caught. Alexander had seen enough. The next morning, her phone rang. "Hi, is this Caroline Miller?" "Yes," she answered cautiously. "My name is Julia. I'm with Harris Holdings. We're opening a new hotel in town and we're looking for experienced domestic managers. Your name was recommended." Caroline blinked. "I think there must be a mistake. We're offering full-time employment, competitive pay, full benefits, and on-site housing. If you're interested, we'd love to meet with you." She gripped the phone. "Is this real?" "Very real," Julia replied kindly. "Can you come by the Hamilton building at 3 p.m. today?" Caroline hesitated. Her heart pounded. Yes, I can." She arrived early. She wore her cleanest clothes, smoothed her hair, and stepped into the gleaming lobby with trembling hands. Alexander was waiting upstairs. He stood when she entered, dressed in a navy suit, but this time, without the usual distance in his eyes. He reached out his hand. "Ms. Miller, I'm Alexander Harris. Thank you for coming." She stared at him, and suddenly recognition lit her face. The man from the bakery. She didn't say anything, but something in her softened. "I won't pretend this is a typical interview," he said gently, "but I saw something in you that day, something rare, and I'd like to offer you a chance." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a real job offer. Manager of domestic operations for the new hotel. Apartment included. Healthcare. Scholarships for her daughters. Stability. Caroline blinked away tears. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Alexander replied. "We'll figure out the rest together." She looked at him, really looked, and saw no agenda. No pity, no trap. Only a door wide open. And for the first time in a long, long time, she walked through. Snow clung to the edges of the city like icing on a cake, softening the sharp corners of buildings and blanketing the sidewalk in white silence. It was 3 days before Christmas, the kind of cold that bit through gloves and made streetlights glow with a hazy, magical shimmer. The city seemed to pause, caught between routine and reverence, as people rushed by with red noses and arms full of wrapped boxes. But Caroline wasn't rushing anywhere. She had just finished a 12-hour day, starting with the hotel's pre-opening, cleaning crew and ending at the diner, where she stayed late to cover for a sick co-worker. Her fingers were raw from scrubbing. Her back ached from standing. Her feet felt like they were walking on needles. But as she stepped onto the bus to go home, her thoughts were only on her daughters. It would be their first Christmas in years, with something to celebrate. A few days ago, she had signed her contract with Harris Holdings. Just like that, her life had started to shift. Not overnight, not in grand sweeping gestures, but in quiet, steady ones. She had given notice at her cleaning jobs. The staff at the new hotel had welcomed her with cautious curiosity. But Alexander had made it clear from day one, she wasn't there out of pity. She was the manager, trusted, valued, and for the first time in a very long time, Caroline believed it too, back in their apartment. Lucy and Abby had strung up handmade decorations, paper snowflakes, stars cut from old magazines, drawings taped to the walls. There was no tree, but a small bundle of pine branches in a bucket gave off that unmistakable Christmas smell. They didn't know that a new apartment was already waiting for them. Caroline wanted it to be a surprise. She stepped off the bus and walked the last few blocks through the snow. Breath curling in the air, thoughts spinning. She hadn't bought them gifts, not yet, but she had wrapped 2 old books they loved in newspaper and tied them with yarn. Tomorrow, she would try to find a small tree, maybe a used one, maybe just a string of lights, anything to make the room feel like Christmas. She didn't notice the black SUV parked across the street. Inside it, Alexander sat watching the front of her building. He had been there for almost 20 minutes. He could have sent someone else, had people who could handle things like this. But this he wanted to do himself. He had grown up surrounded by wealth, Christmases at private resorts, gifts wrapped in velvet boxes, gourmet dinners made by chefs flown in from Europe. But none of it had ever felt like this. None of it had ever felt real. Until them. He stepped out into the snow, coat collar turned up, a simple paper bag in hand. No logos, no ribbons, just something small, chosen with care, wrapped in brown paper. He didn't go to the front door. He waited by the building's entrance, watching as Caroline rounded the corner, exhausted, but still scanning the windows above with hope in her eyes. When she saw him, she stopped. Just for a moment. Her breath caught. He smiled gently. I hope I'm not intruding. Caroline blinked. No, I just didn't expect. He held up the bag. I know you already have groceries, but I brought a little something. Thought the girls might enjoy it. He offered it to her. She hesitated, then took it. Their fingers brushed. You didn't have to. I know, he said. That's exactly why I did. She looked inside. 2 small wooden toys, handcrafted animals with painted details. A bundle of cookies tied with twine, and underneath, tucked carefully in tissue paper, a folded envelope. Her throat tightened. Thank you, she whispered. Really, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he said. But if you're free tomorrow, I'd like to show you something. The hotel suite. It's ready. She nodded. Okay. He smiled, then stepped back. Good night, Caroline. Good night, Alexander. When she climbed the stairs, the girls ran to meet her, nearly knocking the bag from her hands as they leapt into her arms. What's that? Abby asked, eyes wide. Someone sent an early Christmas present, Caroline replied. They opened it together on the worn kitchen table. The girls gasped at the wooden animals, hugging them like they were priceless. Then they found the cookies, and finally, Caroline opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, for a mother whose strength humbles the world. No child should grow up believing magic isn't real. Let this Christmas be the first of many to remind them it is. Beneath the note were 2 small keys, each tied with a red ribbon. Caroline stared at them, hands trembling. The next morning, she didn't go to work. Instead, she packed 1 suitcase, just the essentials, and took Lucy and Abby on the bus to the address written on the envelope. The Harris Hotel. It stood tall and modern, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. But inside, it didn't feel cold or distant. It felt warm, inviting, like someone had poured kindness into the very walls. The front desk staff smiled at her, knew her name. She was taken to the 16th floor. When the elevator doors opened, Alexander was already there. No suit today, just a simple sweater, jeans and a smile that said, "Welcome home." The girls ran ahead, giggling, bursting through the suite door. What they found stopped them in their tracks. A small tree sparkled in the corner, strung with golden lights. Stockings with their names hung above a fireplace. Cozy blankets waited on the couch, books sat on the shelves, and a tray of hot cocoa steamed gently on the table. Caroline walked in slowly. "It's yours," Alexander said, "until your apartment's ready." She turned to him, eyes already glassy. "Why are you doing this?" He paused. "Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten." She tilted her head. "What?" "That life isn't measured by what we build. It's measured by what we give, and who we become while giving." She didn't respond, just looked around the room, at her daughters twirling in joy, at the lights, at this man who had given her more than gifts. He had given her hope. That night, as snow fell softly against the windows, Caroline sat with her daughters beneath the tree, sipping cocoa, listening to their laughter echo in the stillness. And for the first time in years, she believed in Christmas again. She didn't know what the future held, but something inside whispered, "It's going to be beautiful." "Claro, Bianca! Aqui está a continuação completa e fiel, traduzida com naturalidade. Emoção e estilo cinematográfico, como se tivesse sido escrita originalmente em inglês. A narrativa segue exatamente do ponto em que parou. The Harris Hotel hadn't officially opened yet, but inside its quiet, polished halls, something had already begun to take root. Something deeper than decor or service. It was in the way Caroline's laughter started, echoing through the staff corridors. In the way Lucy and Abby's drawings began to appear on the hotel refrigerator. In the way Alexander found himself slowing down just to observe the quiet. Beauty blooming in places he'd long overlooked. Caroline had been living in the suite for 5 days now. She was still adjusting to the softness of the towels, the hum of heating that didn't cut out at midnight, the luxury of warm breakfasts every single morning. But more than anything, she was adjusting to the feeling of safety, of waking up without dread, of brushing her daughter's hair while thinking not just about survival, but about the future, not as something terrifying, but as something she might actually shape. Alexander kept a respectful distance at first. He didn't want to overwhelm her. This wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about being thanked. It was about dignity, about giving without taking, about offering space, not a favor. But he watched, and what he saw shook him. Caroline hadn't slowed down since getting the job. If anything, she worked harder. She showed up early, stayed late. She didn't just lead the housekeeping team, she lifted them. She remembered birthdays. She checked in on the night staff. When a new intern dropped a tray of room keys and froze in panic, she was the first to kneel and help. When the doorman showed up in the snow with torn gloves, she handed him her spare pair without hesitation. One afternoon, Alexander sat in on a staff meeting. He watched as Caroline led the group, calm, precise, and clear, but never cold. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. People listened because she had earned their respect, not through authority, but through empathy. That was something new. He had built hotels in every major city, designed marble lobbies, signature scents, and menus by Michelin-starred chefs. But none of it had ever felt like this. None of it had ever felt alive until she walked in. That evening, long after most of the team had left, Alexander found Caroline alone in the laundry room, folding uniforms by hand. She wore a plain blouse and jeans, her hair tied back. She looked up when he stepped in, surprised but smiling. "You shouldn't be doing that," he said softly. "No one else was here," she shrugged, "and it needed to be done. Besides, it's oddly calming." He leaned against the doorframe. "You know I pay people to do exactly that." "I know," she said, folding with care, "but I've done it my whole life. Old habits." He stepped closer, watching her hands move. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Where did you learn to lead like that? The way you see people, it's different. Caroline paused. I think. When you've spent years being invisible, you learn to notice what matters. You see people no one else sees, and once you know how much that means, you never want anyone around you to feel how you once felt. He stared at her. That's not just leadership. That's healing. She smiled faintly. Maybe it's survival, just with a softer edge. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was honest. He stepped in and began folding beside her. They worked quietly, hands moving in rhythm, the scent of warm linen in the air, machines humming like background music. As they left the laundry room, he glanced at her. You've changed this place. She blinked. It hasn't even opened yet. I wasn't talking about the hotel. She didn't answer. But something in her eyes softened. That night, Alexander went home and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was an old photograph, his mother standing proudly in front of their first family motel. She had died when he was 16. She'd been stern, hard-working, fiercely principled. She'd scrubbed rooms herself, taught him to look people in the eye, to never underestimate anyone based on their clothes or salary. He hadn't thought of her in a long time, but Caroline reminded him of her, not in how she looked, but in how she moved through the world, with purpose, with quiet strength. He realized then she wasn't changing because of him. He was changing because of her. The next morning he arrived earlier than usual. The girls were in the kitchen with the hotel chef, giggling as they tried to arrange fruit into smiley faces on their pancakes. Caroline stood nearby with a cup of coffee, her posture relaxed, her eyes glowing with the kind of peace that can't be faked. Alexander stood in the doorway, unseen for a moment, just taking it all in. Then Caroline noticed him. She didn't panic, didn't rush to explain. She just smiled and waved him in. They've eaten more berries than they've used, she said, gesturing at Abby's purple-stained fingers. He laughed. Sounds like a successful morning to me. He joined them for coffee, listening to the girls chatter about absolutely everything. How one had lost a baby tooth, how the other wanted to learn ballet, how they both believed the hotel fireplace was probably magic. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt what it might mean to truly belong, not to a company or a portfolio, but to a life. Later that day, while reviewing the final guest welcome packages, he made a quiet decision. The Harris Hotel wouldn't just be about luxury anymore. It would be about people. He called a meeting with his executive team. We're rewriting the mission statement, he said. They looked confused. I want embedded community programs. I want local hires, childcare options for employees, meals for underpaid families during the holidays. And I want our doors open, not just to our richest guests, but to the people who keep this place running. A hand went up. Sir, respectfully, is this a PR strategy? Alexander looked up, calm but firm. No, this is who we are now. If that's a problem for anyone, feel free to step out. No one moved, because in that moment, everyone understood he wasn't leading from a boardroom anymore. He was leading from something deeper, something real. That night, the hotel held its soft opening for internal guests, staff, families, partners. The lobby buzzed with soft music, clinking glasses, and a warmth that wasn't just from the lights. Caroline stood near the back, watching it all quietly. She wasn't in a fancy dress, just her uniform. But Alexander crossed the room to find her anyway. You're quiet tonight, he said. Just taking it in. He followed her gaze. Laughter, light, life. You helped build this. She smiled. It feels strange. Why? Because it doesn't feel like a job. It feels like a second chance. He looked at her. It is. She turned toward him fully this time. And for the first time, there was no fear in her expression. Just openness, trust, something unspoken. This hotel is beautiful, she said. But what really makes it matter is the people inside it. And you're letting that happen. That's rare. He didn't speak for a moment. Then I had no idea how much I needed this until I met you. And as the city lights glowed outside the tall windows, something settled between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. Two lives slowly folding into one another, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. A quiet revolution built not on grand gestures, but on kindness, and the kind of strength that never has to raise its voice. Because it simply endures. The snowfall had stopped by the time. The hotel's front doors opened to the public for the first time. It wasn't a grand event, no red carpets or press coverage. Just a soft opening for a few select guests, some travel critics, and local officials. But inside, something far more important was happening, quietly, intentionally. Caroline stood by the reception desk, clipboard in hand, overseeing every last detail. Her team moved with practiced rhythm, and she followed them with proud, attentive eyes. Every flower in the lobby had been perfectly placed. Every guest room checked and rechecked. The air was delicately scented with warm vanilla, cedarwood, and a faint note of citrus. It felt like a symphony, and she was its conductor. No one would have guessed that just 3 weeks earlier, she had been splitting a raisin, bun between her daughters on a freezing street corner. From the upper mezzanine, Alexander watched. He had arrived early too, but not to review inventory or comb through spreadsheets. He was watching her, not with curiosity anymore, but with admiration. There was something magnetic in the way she moved, how staff leaned toward her, how even the guests seemed to pick up on the quiet sincerity beneath her professionalism. He hadn't known what to expect when he first brought her into the company. It hadn't been a strategic decision, it had been instinct. But what she brought wasn't just competence, it was culture. A new pulse moving through the hotel like electricity. At exactly 10 a.m., Caroline stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. She didn't need space because she was overwhelmed, but because the moment felt too big to fit within 4 walls. Her phone buzzed, a message from her old landlord. The apartment had been re-rented. That chapter, those nights without heat, those mornings without breakfast, was officially over. She let her hand fall to her side and exhaled. She didn't notice Alexander until he was standing just a few feet away. "Too cold to be standing still," he said. She smiled. "Too full inside to stay in." They both laughed softly. "You've done an incredible job," he added. "Thank you." He paused for a second. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Have you ever thought about what you'd do if you didn't have to worry about bills or survival?" She looked at him surprised. "I used to think about that all the time. Now, not so much. I guess I'm still adjusting to the idea that stability is real." He nodded. "That makes sense. But let me ask differently. If you could shape your future any way you wanted, what would it look like?" She was quiet, then said softly, "Peace, purpose, safety for my girls, and something of my own. Something I could build and look at and say, 'I made that.'" Alexander reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. It wasn't thick, but it was official. He handed it to her. Caroline hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a business proposal, a new hotel brand, separate from Harris Holdings. Something independent, something soulful. "Hearth Hotels," the logo said. She looked up at him, confused. "You're leaving your company?" He nodded. "I've been thinking about it for a while. The board wants more automation, cost-cutting, outsourcing. They want numbers. I want people. I want warmth. What I saw in that bakery that day. That's the heartbeat. I want to build from now on. And this," she whispered, flipping through the pages, "this is a partnership offer." "It is," he said, meeting her gaze. "I don't want to build it alone. You've shown me what hospitality has been missing. Empathy, story, heart. I can bring capital and structure, but I want the soul to come from you." Caroline's hands trembled slightly as she closed the folder. "This is more than a promotion," she said, almost breathless. "It's a beginning." She sat on the stone ledge near the hotel entrance. Snow crunched softly under her boots. "What does it mean exactly?" she asked. "A founding role," he replied. "Executive leadership, profit sharing, creative input, training programs designed by you, hiring based on values, not just experience. Real change and real ownership." She stared down at the folder in her lap. "I never even graduated college." "I know," he said quietly. "And I don't care." She looked up at him again, but this time she saw him differently, not as a businessman, but as someone offering her a space to grow, not out of charity, but out of recognition. "I need to think," she whispered. "Take all the time you need." But deep down, she already knew. That night, after putting the girls to bed, she sat in the suite's quiet sitting room with the folder in her lap. unopened again, but every word inside was already etched into her memory. Her heart wasn't racing from fear, it was racing from possibility. She remembered Lucy once asking her, "Mommy, do people like us ever get lucky?" And now she had the answer. It wasn't luck. It was grace. A door had opened, and for the first time, she had been invited to walk through it, not alone, not as a token, but as an equal. She thought of the woman who had stood in the bakery counting coins. She thought of how far she'd come. And she thought of what her daughters would learn, not from her pain, but from her choice to rise. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the hotel early, as usual, but Caroline was already waiting. She stood in the conference room, folder in hand, eyes calm and clear. "I'm in," she said. He smiled, not the press-ready smile, but the one that came from deep inside. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "But I have one condition." "Anything." "We do this together, not with me hidden behind the scenes. I want to be seen. I want people to know I belong here." Alexander nodded. "You've already proven you do." And just like that, a new chapter began. They worked late into the night that week, planning, designing, dreaming. Not of another luxury chain, but of something more. A company that wouldn't just house people, but honor them. Hotels that didn't just offer rooms, but restored dignity. And Caroline, who once folded napkins, until her fingers bled, now sat beside the man who gave her a seat at the table, not as charity, but as partner, as visionary as equal. It was still dark when Caroline opened her eyes. Not from anxiety, like it used to be, but out of habit, years of waking early to race. Between jobs had taught her that quiet mornings held a kind of sacredness. And now, for the first time in her adult life, those early hours weren't about survival. They were about beginning again. She moved silently through the suite, careful not to wake Lucy and Abby, who were still bundled under warm blankets in the adjoining room. The hotel lights outside filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden patterns across the wooden floors. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It felt like peace. In the kitchen, Caroline brewed coffee and stood by the wide window, watching the city blink to life below. She still couldn't quite believe this was her home now. Not temporary, not borrowed, home. Her name was on the lease. Her daughters had real beds. She had keys to a future that felt real. By 6:45 a.m., Lucy was awake, rubbing her eyes, shuffling into the kitchen with wild curls and sleepy excitement. Abby followed a minute later, dragging her stuffed cat by one leg. "Mama," Abby whispered, "are we really living in a castle?" Caroline laughed softly and knelt to hug them both. "Not a castle, sweetheart," she said, kissing their heads, "but somewhere special, somewhere safe." Later that morning, after breakfast and goodbyes, the girls were picked up for their first full day at their new preschool, tuition fully covered by the hotel's staff program. And Caroline walked into the lower floors of the hotel no longer as a guest. She walked in as its heartbeat. Her new office was simple, nothing extravagant. A medium-sized room with a desk, a large wall calendar, and photos of the staff she now oversaw. On the shelf sat a fresh bouquet, placed there by the very cleaning crew she had once worked alongside. Next to it was a note, "You see us, and now we see you." She didn't need degrees hanging on the wall. She didn't need plaques or fancy titles. Her power came from the way people looked at her in the halls, with respect, with trust, and most of all, with belief. In the following weeks, Caroline settled into her role with the kind of grace that only someone who had lived every step of the ladder could carry. She didn't manage from above. She walked the floors. She greeted by name. She listened. She taught receptionists to read guests' moods before asking questions. She showed kitchen assistants how to find rhythm in their prep work. She worked with housekeeping to design a rotating schedule that let single parents switch shifts without penalties when their kids were sick. And people noticed, not just the staff, but the guests. Reviews poured in, not just about the design or the amenities, but about the feeling. Words like warmth, soul, and authenticity showed up over and over again. Caroline's touch wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. Meanwhile, Alexander had reshaped his entire business model around what was happening at Hearth Hotels. He resigned from the Harris Holdings board, The announcement made headlines. Luxury tycoon leaves. Empire for human-centered vision. But he wasn't chasing publicity. He was chasing impact. He now spent more time at the Hearth Hotel than anywhere else. His office, just down the hall from Caroline's, had once displayed trophies and architectural renderings. Now it featured drawings from Abby and Lucy taped to the back wall. One was a stick-figure version of him labeled Mr. Hotel Man, holding hands with two smiling girls. Caroline had laughed when she first saw it. "I think you've been adopted," she joked. "I'm honored," he replied with a quiet smile. Over time, their relationship shifted. What began as professional respect grew into something deeper. They shared long conversations at the end of their workdays, sometimes over coffee, sometimes while walking through the garden terrace. They talked about childhood, about failure, about dreams they'd buried, and ones they were still afraid to say out loud. Caroline learned that Alexander had grown up in a roadside motel, that he'd worked the front desk at age 11, that his mother had passed away when he was a teen, that for him, success had always been armor now. With her and the girls, he didn't need armor anymore. He could just be. And in return, Alexander learned how to listen, not just as a leader, but as a man. He saw how Caroline led rooms, not by commanding attention, but by understanding it, how her calm anchored people, how she could make even silence feel meaningful. He began noticing the little things, how she always left fruit in the break room fridge, how she kept spare socks in her bag in case one of the girls had an accident, how she looked people in the eye, always with kindness. Then came the moment that changed everything. A wealthy guest accused a housekeeper of stealing a necklace, something that had simply slipped under a pillow. The guest was loud, aggressive, demanded the woman be fired. The housekeeper was in tears. Alexander was preparing to step in, but Caroline was already there. She calmly asked the guest to join her in the lounge for 5 minutes. No anger, no confrontation. She told a story about the time she had been accused of stealing as a waitress, simply because her coat was worn and her shoes didn't match. About how she had stood there, humiliated, while others judged her by what she lacked. The guest was silent. Then quietly he apologized, returned to his room, checked out early. Later, Alexander asked her how she knew that would work. "I didn't," she said. "But I know shame only holds power when we stay silent. Sometimes sharing your pain is how you free someone else from theirs." And that was when Alexander knew Caroline wasn't just transforming the hotel. She was transforming him. He started imagining a future beyond deals and deadlines, a life where connection mattered more than control, where dinners around a small table with Abby and Lucy mattered more than any boardroom. He started visiting the suite more often, not as a CEO, but as someone who belonged. The girls began calling him Alex. He read them bedtime stories, helped with homework, tried to braid Lucy's hair once and ended up with such a mess that Caroline had to cut it free. They laughed for days, and slowly, without labels, something beautiful grew. Not just between Caroline and Alexander, but around them. The hotel began to feel like a family. The staff felt seen. Guests returned not just for the luxury, but for the feeling. And Caroline, she hadn't just rebuilt her life. She had built home. It started with small moments. A giggle in the hallway. A misplaced drawing slipped into Alexander's briefcase. A pair of little sneakers parked neatly beside his polished shoes at the suite entrance. Nothing grand or orchestrated, just quiet. Ordinary signs of something soft and steady taking root. Alexander had never imagined himself as a father figure. He was used to numbers, negotiations, and hotel launches, not school pickups, loose teeth or bedtime stories. But Lucy and Abby didn't seem to care. They had claimed him, and in a way, he had let them. What surprised him most wasn't how quickly the girls grew attached, it was how much he grew, attached in return. At first, he offered help cautiously. A ride to school when Caroline had an early meeting. An extra lunch packed by the hotel chef by accident. But soon, those little gestures became routine. He started showing up for things, teacher meetings, weekend outings, even dance recitals, where the twins wore glittery wings and squealed with nervous excitement. And every time, he was there, quiet, steady, always with that same warm smile reserved just for them. Caroline noticed, of course. She had always been protective of her girls. Their world had been just the three of them for so long that letting someone else in felt risky, especially someone like Alexander, whose life was so far from everything she had known. But he didn't push. He never asked for a title or claimed space he hadn't earned. He simply showed up again and again. And in time, her hesitation turned into something else. One evening, after a long day at the hotel, Caroline returned to the suite to find the girls, curled up on the couch in their pajamas, both asleep on either side of Alexander, who was still in his suit, head tilted back completely still. He looked so out of place and yet so right. She stood there quietly, watching them breathe in rhythm. It was the first time in years she felt her chest loosen without warning. No worry, no fear, just gratitude. She tiptoed over, draped a blanket across all three of them, and for the first time allowed herself to imagine what life could look like with someone by her side. Not because she needed saving, but because she wanted to be seen. The shift became undeniable in the weeks that followed. They spent more time together outside of work. Sometimes with the girls, walks through the park, movie nights in the suite, spontaneous pancake dinners. Other times, just the two of them, talks over tea, planning meetings that turned into personal confessions. Caroline learned that Alexander had once been engaged, but called it off when he realized the relationship had become more about appearances than connection. That he'd never really had a place to land emotionally. He had built empires, yes, but never a home. And now, without even meaning to, he had found one in a kitchen full of coloring books and mismatched mugs. One Saturday, while they were sitting on a park bench watching the girls chase each other in circles, Caroline turned to him. "Why us?" she asked. Not accusing, just curious. Alexander looked at her for a long time. "Because you reminded me what real looks like," he said, "and I didn't know how much I needed that." She nodded slowly. Then she said something that surprised even herself. "They talk about you when you're not around." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah," she smiled. "Abby says you're the tallest grown-up in the world. Lucy says you smell like books and cinnamon. And both of them, they feel safe with you." He swallowed hard. "That's all I ever wanted to be," he said softly. That night, Caroline found herself standing in front of the mirror, long after the girls were asleep. She wasn't dressed up. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. But something in her reflection felt different. She looked like a woman reclaiming her story, not just surviving, becoming. The next evening, it was Lucy who asked the question. They were sitting at the dining table, coloring together, when she looked up and said, "Mama, is Mr. Alex part of our family?" Caroline blinked. Abby chimed in. "He's here a lot. And he always knows where our jelly is." They both turned to her with innocent, hopeful eyes. And Caroline, who had once walked home in the snow, with empty hands and a heavy heart, felt tears threaten. She smiled gently. "I don't know yet," she said truthfully, "but I think maybe. He's becoming part of it." The next morning, Alexander came by with hot cocoa and cinnamon rolls. As soon as he stepped inside, Lucy ran up and threw her arms around his waist. "We decided you're family now," she declared. Abby nodded, still chewing a bite of roll. "You're Mr. Dad." Alexander froze, and then, slowly, he knelt to their level. "That's a pretty big title," he said. "Are you sure I'm ready for it?" They both nodded with absolute certainty, and Caroline stood behind them, hand over her mouth, eyes full of something that looked a lot like forever. Later that night, Alexander and Caroline sat side by side on the balcony, the city lights sparkling below, the cool wind wrapping gently around them. "I never thought this would be my life," she whispered. "Neither did I," he replied. Then softly, "Do you think there's a word for what this is?" She thought for a moment. "Maybe not yet," she said, "but whatever it is, I don't want to run from it." He reached for her hand. "Me neither." And in that simple, quiet moment, without grand declarations or promises, they stepped into something real, something chosen, something unexpected, a family. Not because of shared blood, but because of shared love. It had been a quiet week, the kind of stretch where routine settles into something warm and familiar. The hotel was running smoothly. Caroline's leadership had taken root, and the twins were thriving at their new school, coming home each day with glitter in their hair, stories tumbling out of their mouths, and hugs that lingered like little anchors of joy. But there was one detail no one had spoken about: Alexander's birthday. Caroline only found out by accident, overhearing a passing comment between him and a supplier. He hadn't mentioned it. No party planned, no celebration scheduled. He didn't even take the day off. When she asked him directly, he just waved it off. "It's just another day," he said. But it wasn't, not to her, not to the girls, and not to the staff who had come to admire the man, who had quietly changed their lives, without ever asking to be noticed. So Caroline decided to do something about it. She didn't plan a grand event or invite the press. That wasn't Alexander's style. Instead, she gathered the only people who truly mattered: Lucy, Abby, and a small group of staff who had been there since the very beginning. People who knew his heart, not just his name on the letterhead. Together they planned something simple, something genuine, something full of heart. It started with the girls. They decorated the staff lounge with hand-drawn signs. "Happy birthday, Alex," scrawled in crayon and glitter glue. They made paper chains and taped cut-out stars to the windows. Abby insisted on making a card shaped like a hotel room key. "He let us in," she said seriously, "so we give him one too." Caroline smiled, holding back tears. On the morning of his birthday, the girls woke early and tiptoed around the suite, whispering like little spies. Caroline handed them a small wrapped box. Inside, a hardback notebook and a fountain pen. They had all saved up to buy together over the past 2 weeks. Abby had written in crooked letters inside the cover, "For your ideas, your dreams, and your new family." That afternoon, as Alexander returned from a board lunch, he walked into the staff lounge expecting to review reports. Instead, he stopped cold in the doorway. The lights were dimmed. A string of warm fairy lights hung from the ceiling. A homemade chocolate cake with strawberries sat on the table, uneven but perfect. Staff stood smiling with paper cups in hand. Lucy ran toward him with a party hat. "Surprise!" she shouted. He blinked. "What is this?" "Your birthday," Caroline said, stepping forward. "You weren't going to celebrate, so we decided to do it for you." He looked around the room. The dishwasher from the kitchen was there, holding punch. The doorman stood beside the concierge, both clapping. Even the cleaning crew, usually too busy to pause, had made time to be there. Alexander's throat tightened. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Caroline said softly. "Just let us celebrate you. Just for today." He stood frozen as Lucy placed the party hat on his head, slightly too small and definitely crooked. Then Abby handed him the handmade card. He opened it, read the first line, and closed it again. His eyes glistened. "You did all this?" he asked Caroline quietly. "We all did," she replied. "You've given so much. We just wanted to give something back." He let out a long breath. Then she handed him the gift from the girls and herself. He unwrapped it carefully. When he saw the pen and notebook, his hands stilled. "I haven't used a fountain pen in years," he murmured. "My mother used to write with one." Caroline smiled. "Now it's yours. To start your own story." He nodded, barely holding it together. They cut the cake. They laughed. Someone took a photo. Alexander in the middle. Lucy and Abby on either side, staff all around. Someone joked that he looked like a dad at a birthday party thrown by his kids. He didn't argue, because that's exactly how it felt. Later that night, long after the cake was gone and the lounge was quiet again, Alexander sat alone in the same chair, the notebook still in his hands. Caroline stayed behind to clean up, though there wasn't much left. She brought him a cup of warm tea and sat across from him. "That meant a lot," he said quietly. "I'm glad," she said. "I haven't celebrated my birthday in over 10 years. "Why?" he shrugged. "When my mom died, it stopped feeling like something worth celebrating. After that, it just felt easier to ignore it." Caroline didn't respond right away. She just looked at him with that calm, unwavering gaze. "I'm sorry," she said at last. "Not for today, but for the years that made you believe it didn't matter." He looked down at the notebook in his lap. This does matter," he whispered. "You made it matter again." They sat in silence. the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Then he looked up and said something he hadn't said to anyone in years. "I want this to be more than a moment. I want it to be the beginning of something I never knew how to ask for." She tilted her head gently. "Like what?" He met her eyes, completely unguarded. "A life with you, with the girls, if you'll have me." She didn't answer right away, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she did. And she knew the weight of it. This wasn't a grand proposal. There were no rings, no rehearsed speeches, just a man who had finally found a place where he could be fully himself, and a woman who had spent her whole life surviving and was finally ready to live. She reached across the table and took his hand. "We already do," she whispered. Outside, snow began to fall again, not in storms, but in quiet, soft flakes like a blessing, and in the glow of party lights that had long gone unnoticed. A man who had once built empires finally allowed himself to believe in something far more powerful, belonging. And in that still, sacred space, surrounded by crumbs of cake, crayon drawings, and love spoken not in declarations, but in presence, one simple truth settled in. Love doesn't always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it comes softly, with a paper key and a whispered yes. The Hearth Hotel had become more than a project. It was a living, breathing space, a place where warmth wasn't just part of the decor, but part of the people. Reviews poured in from guests, who didn't just talk about thread, counts or skyline views, but about how the place made them feel. A kind of quiet humanity, a sense of being cared for, even in a city that usually rushed past without noticing. Alexander had never built anything like it, and he knew it. But success, even when rooted in empathy, attracts attention, and not all of it was welcome. In late March, he received a call from a Harris Holdings board member. "We need to talk," the voice said, short and cold. "You've built something that's getting attention. That's fine. But your name is still attached to us, and our investors are asking questions." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that involve spreadsheets, cost analysis, profit margins. You're running that place like a non-profit. 6 partners have reached out this week asking why your staff-to-room ratio is nearly double the industry standard." "It works," Alexander replied. "People stay longer. They come back. They talk about it. That's not the point. It's not scalable. Your staff has healthcare, flexible hours, paid overtime, emergency childcare. That's not hospitality, Alexander. That's charity." There was a pause. Alexander's voice was steady. "It's humanity." But the conversation didn't end there. The board was preparing a formal meeting to evaluate his stake, his use of resources, and whether his new direction aligned with Harris Holdings' values. In short, he had built something too kind for the luxury world. He ended the call and stared out the office window, fists resting against his lips. The view hadn't changed. The same skyline, the same birds circling a grey sky. But something inside him had. They didn't understand. They couldn't. That evening, he found Caroline in the kitchen, helping Lucy and Abby bake cookies shaped like hotel keys. Abby was covered in flour. Lucy was trying to write names with icing. Caroline looked up and saw it on his face immediately. "What happened?" Alexander didn't answer at first. He sat on a stool and watched the girls. "I'm going to be asked to make a decision," he said softly. "Between them and this." Caroline waited. Then he looked at her. "They want me to scale back. Cut staff, increase automation, remove the human-centered systems we built. They say it's not sustainable." She dried her hands and sat beside him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I built something honest for the first time in my life, and now they want me to take it apart." She placed her hand over his. "And if you don't, they'll try to take it, or make it impossible to grow." There was silence. Then Caroline said, "You gave this place your name, your values, your heart. Maybe the problem isn't that it doesn't fit their mold. Maybe the mold is the problem." He looked at her, really looked. And in her quiet steadiness, he found clarity. That night, Alexander sat at his desk and wrote a letter. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was clear, precise, effective immediately. "I withdraw my name, influence, and future stake from all decision-making at Harris Holdings. I decline further funding, guidance, or association. I will not build something with people who ask me to sacrifice the dignity of those who make it possible." The next morning, he handed the letter to Julia, his longtime assistant. She read it twice. "You're really doing this?" He nodded. She smiled. "Took you long enough." He let out a breath of laughter. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" She folded the letter carefully. "You're finally doing your thing." The news spread quickly. Investors were stunned. The media ran quiet stories about a CEO walking away from an empire. But inside the Hearth Hotel, there was no panic, only pride. The staff understood. Alexander hadn't just defended a building. He had defended them. And Caroline. She didn't say much. But that night, after the girls had fallen asleep and the world went quiet, she placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "You chose us." He turned, eyes tired but shining. "I choose you again. Every time." She stepped closer. "I know." That weekend, the staff organized something small. A dinner in the garden terrace behind the hotel. String lights hung between trees. White cloths over folding tables. Dishes from every background. No speeches. Just laughter, music, and the kind of joy that comes when people know they matter. Alexander stood beside Caroline with a paper plate in hand, surrounded by people who had once been names on resumes. Now they were something else. His reason. Lucy ran up holding 2 cookies. "I made one shaped like a heart." She beamed. He crouched down, smiling. "It's perfect." Abby tugged on his coat. "Are you sad you left your old job?" He paused, then looked around at the lights, the people, the woman beside him, and said, "No, I think I finally found the real one." Later that night, with the garden quiet and the air cooling, Caroline stood beneath the lights, her fingers laced in his. "I don't think we were supposed to meet that day." "Udtu," she whispered. "I think we were supposed to change each other." He turned to her. "We still are." Above them, the lights swayed in the breeze, gentle reminders that in a world built for profit, there is still room for kindness. And sometimes, choosing people over power doesn't just change a company. It changes a life. The official split from Harris Holdings wasn't just a statement. It was a seismic shift in an industry where image was everything. Alexander Harris, stepping away from his empire to launch something smaller, more human, sent ripples through boardrooms and business sections across the country. But to Alexander, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like breathing for the first time. He spent the next several weeks not writing memos or attending luxury conferences, but sitting at kitchen tables, walking hotel hallways and talking to real people, staff, guests, community leaders, listening, asking what hospitality meant to them, what they needed. The goal wasn't growth anymore. The goal was connection, and out of that came a new vision, not just an expansion of Hearth Hotels, something deeper, a movement. Caroline was there from the very beginning, not as a figurehead, not behind the scenes, but at the center. She wasn't just a manager anymore. She was a co-founder, a partner. Her name was on every document, every blueprint, every contract, and this time, it wasn't because Alexander gave it to her. It was because she had earned it, through every step, every sleepless night, every act of quiet leadership, every room she had once cleaned with her own hands. The new company would be called Hearth and Haven. Not just hotels, experiences, boutique properties in underserved communities that would offer more than rooms and minibars. They would host job training programs, childcare centers, community kitchens, art spaces, food drives, hotels that didn't just shelter people, but uplifted them. They began with one property, an old decaying inn on the outskirts of a post-industrial town that had lost its economic engine years ago. The building was falling apart. The windows were boarded. The roof leaked. But the foundation was solid, and so were their intentions. "We'll rebuild it," Alexander said, standing beside her in the cold, both in hard hats, wind blowing around them. Caroline looked up at the broken facade, vines curling through the brickwork. "You really think people will come?" He turned to her, calm and steady. "They won't come for what it is. They'll come for what it stands for." She smiled. They rolled up their sleeves, literally. Caroline picked the color schemes with the help of Abby's doodles. Lucy helped name the rooms: Sunlight Suite, Hope Room, the Kindness Loft. Alexander handled zoning and permits. Caroline personally interviewed every hire. Most were single mothers, veterans, young people who had dropped out of school, people who had been overlooked, and every one of them looked at Caroline and saw something that made them believe they could try again. The first night they stayed at the nearly finished inn, the walls still smelled faintly of fresh paint. The beds were made, the carpets new, but there were no photos, no press, no guests, just Caroline, Alexander, the girls, and a pizza box on the floor of the lobby. They sat cross-legged, eating, laughing. Abby did an impression of a grumpy guest. Lucy read the safety manual like it was a dramatic poem. Caroline told stories about her first job cleaning a hotel, not unlike this one. It didn't have windows that opened, she said. The walls were beige. The air was stale. No one ever said good morning. Alexander looked around at the open windows. The soft colors, the plants in the corner. This one's already different. The grand opening was small, on purpose. No ribbon cutting, no press kits. Just the people from the town. Families brought casseroles and folding chairs. Kids ran around the parking lot. The mayor gave a short speech about second chances. A housekeeper read a poem she'd written about rebuilding. A former guest from the original Hearth Hotel flew in just to say, "I stayed at a place that made me feel human again. And I want that everywhere." Alexander and Caroline stood at the edge of the garden, hand in hand. "This doesn't feel like a company," she said. "It feels like a family tree," he smiled. "Exactly what it's supposed to be." They hadn't just launched a new brand. They had rewritten the blueprint for what hospitality could look like. And soon, other cities started calling. People who had heard whispers about what they were doing. Letters started arriving, some typed, some handwritten from hotel workers, social workers, students studying hospitality. "I want to build something like yours someday." And Alexander, once known for his empire of luxury, now found his greatest pride in small moments. A child hugging the front desk clerk, a dishwasher becoming a supervisor, a mother finding work and shelter under the same roof for the first time in months. And always Caroline by his side, not as a symbol, but as the soul of everything they had created. One afternoon, as they walked the perimeter of their second site under renovation, Alexander turned to her. "Did you ever imagine your life would look like this?" She didn't answer right away. She looked around at the scaffolding, the new garden plan, the golden sunlight falling against the back wall of what would soon be bedrooms. Laughter, safety, then softly, "No, I used to dream of stability, but this is legacy." He stopped walking. "And how does it feel to be the one shaping it?" She turned to face him. "Terrifying and beautiful." He nodded. "I feel the same." And then, without ceremony or script, he said, "Let's build a life like this too. Not just hotels. A home, for real." Caroline looked at him, really looked. Not the CEO, not the rescuer, just the man. And she knew, deep in her chest, that this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one that would be remembered. Not because of headlines, not because of money, but because two people had dared to build something soft in a world that had grown so hard. Something whole together. Within 2 years, Hearth and Haven became more than a promising venture. It became a case study in everything the hospitality industry had forgotten. That people didn't just want service, they wanted significance. That comfort wasn't about extravagance, but about being welcomed exactly as you are. Alexander and Caroline had opened 4 locations across the country. None in major tourist cities, none near famous landmarks. Instead, they chose neighborhoods where hotels once felt like unreachable luxuries. And in each place they built more than a building. They built trust. In Detroit, the hotel partnered with a local women's shelter to offer paid job training. In Tulsa, they opened a public reading room in the lobby, where children could borrow books or attend story hour. In New Orleans, they hosted free Sunday jazz brunches for elderly neighbors. None of it came from a marketing strategy. It came from listening, from walking the halls, from drinking tea with housekeepers, from sitting on stoops with single dads and exhausted nurses, from understanding that community is the only luxury that can't be mass-produced. And at the heart of it all was Caroline. Her face began to appear in interviews. Not the glossy, filtered kind, but real conversations. She spoke openly about her past, about walking into a bakery with $2, about folding uniforms alone in a hotel basement, about how empathy isn't weakness, it's structure. "I never studied leadership," she once said. "I just lived enough of the hard parts to know what people need when they arrive." She didn't seek attention, but the world gave it to her anyway. Forbes called her the quiet force behind hospitality's human revolution. Time magazine listed her among the most influential voices in business, but none of it changed her. She still rode the bus sometimes, just to remember what it felt like. She still carried an extra snack in her bag, just in case. And every night, she still tucked Lucy and Abby into bed herself, now in a warm apartment above their newest hotel, filled with mismatched furniture and morning light. Alexander had grown quieter too, not distant, rooted, grounded. He stepped away from press and politics. His joy came from small things, guests smiling at handwritten welcome cards, staff surprising each other with birthday cupcakes, Abby drawing her own Hotel of the Future in sidewalk chalk. He and Caroline never made a big announcement about their relationship. It just was, solid, constant, real. At work they were co-founders. At home they were family. Sometimes when asked about their dynamic, Caroline would simply say, "We built a company the same way. We built us, brick by brick, with more heart than plan." At the Hearth and Haven annual retreat, held in a converted barn in upstate New York, Caroline stood on a small stage. No teleprompter, just her voice. "I want to say something," she began. "You may think we built this brand for others, for guests, for image. But the truth is, we built it for ourselves, for the part of us that once felt invisible, for the version of us that sat in silence, hoping someone would say, 'You matter.' This company was never about rooms. It was about returning dignity, returning purpose, returning home." The applause was quiet, not because it wasn't heartfelt, but because everything they'd created had always been gentle. Later, a night porter named Elijah approached her with tears in his eyes. "My daughter applied to college last week," he said. "I wouldn't have even known how to help her if it weren't for this job. You gave me back the belief that I could be a good father." Caroline didn't hug him like a CEO. She hugged him like a friend. That night, after the folding chairs were packed and the dessert trays cleaned, Alexander found her outside beneath the stars. He wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. "You okay?" "I'm more than okay," she said. "I'm full," he smiled. "I think this is what legacy feels like." She turned to him. "No, this is what love looks like when it reaches everyone." They didn't need to say anything else. Because they knew success wasn't about spotlight. It was about impact. And every person they had welcomed, every soul they had lifted, was a thread in the fabric of something that would outlast them both. Spring came gently that year. It unfolded in petals on windowsills, in long afternoons with the girls playing until dinner, in the scent of lavender drifting through the open windows of their apartment, above the Hearth and Haven flagship. The light had changed too, warmer, slower, like the world was finally catching its breath, and inside their home, something else was blooming. It wasn't dramatic. There were no declarations, just life unfolding in quiet ways, like the morning Lucy accidentally called Alexander Dad and froze wide-eyed until he knelt beside her and said, "You can call me that whenever your heart says it." Or the way Caroline would gently take his hand while talking to a guest, or brushing Abby's hair, or watching the news. Not for show, just because. Because he was home. Still, there was one step Alexander hadn't taken, not because of fear, but because of reverence. He wanted to ask Caroline to marry him, but not for the headline, not for the tradition, because what they'd built, this life, this story, deserved to be named. So he waited for the moment when the gesture would match the meaning. It came on a soft Sunday morning in late April. Caroline had been planting herbs with the girls. Abby had named herself Queen of Basil. Lucy tried to bury a time capsule made of friendship bracelets and lemonade coupons. "Can I steal Mommy for a minute?" he asked. The girls giggled and waved her off. Caroline looked curious. "Everything okay?" He nodded and led her to the wooden bench. Under the olive tree, they planted their first year. He reached into his pocket, not for a ring box, but for a drawing. She unfolded it slowly. It was a child's blueprint. Crayon lines, misspelled labels, stick figures. One of Lucy's, their family drawn in front of a hotel, Caroline, the twins, and Alexander in the middle wearing a crown labeled Best Dad. Underneath, in Alexander's handwriting, "We've built a home, a company, a life, and I would be honored to build forever with you. Will you marry me?" Caroline didn't cry at first. She just stared, then looked at him. "You really want to be part of this chaos forever?" He smiled. "There's no place I'd rather be." She nodded, overcome, and wrapped her arms around him. The girls came running. "Did he ask?" "Did you say yes?" Alexander lifted them both in his arms. "You're officially stuck with me now." The wedding was small, in the hotel garden, surrounded by the people they had grown with. Staff brought flowers from their yards. The chef made a lopsided 3-tier cake. Lucy and Abby walked Caroline down the aisle, holding her hands, like they were guiding her home. Caroline wore a simple white dress, lavender in her hair. Alexander wore a navy suit, tie slightly crooked because Lucy fixed it. The vows were short, but real. "I promise," Caroline whispered, "to love you not because you saved me, but because you saw me. Every part. Even the ones I thought weren't worth seeing." Alexander's voice shook. "I promise to never stop building with you. Not because I need to, but because with you, I finally understand what a life is for." They kissed, not for the cameras, but for the journey. Later, they danced barefoot under paper lanterns. The girls fell asleep in a guest room, surrounded by ribbon and cake crumbs, and on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket, Caroline and Alexander stood in silence. "You know what I've been thinking?" she said. "What?" "That we started with a raisin bun and $2. He chuckled. "And I started with a cold coffee and no idea what was about to happen." She turned to him. "It's wild, isn't it? All the things that had to go wrong, so the right things could find us." He nodded. "Sometimes the broken road is the only one that leads to something whole." They stood still for a while, and then Caroline whispered, not to him but to the world, "I'm grateful, not for the pain, not for the struggle, but for what it made me become. Because in the end, she hadn't just found love. She had found home." Caroline didn't win the lottery. She didn't stumble into a miracle. She showed up, every day, with empty pockets, tired eyes, and a heart that never stopped fighting. And Alexander, he didn't just give her a chance. He let her change him. Because sometimes the ones we think we're helping are the ones who save us. The story isn't about wealth. It's about worth. It's about a mother who turned pain into purpose, a man who traded power for presence, and 2 little girls who reminded the world that love is the only thing that multiplies when you give it away. Now it's your turn. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me, where are you watching from? Your support keeps this channel alive.